What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Warden, one of my favorite classes in the game right now. Magicka Wardens, at least with the Bear Ultimate, are actually one of the strongest Magicka DPS classes out right now. They're actually capable of pulling higher than a non-pet Sorc, and can actually pull about level or even with a pet Sorc. When compared to the other typical ranged classes. They only fall short when compared to Magicka Nightblade, but even then they come very close to beating out the Magicka Nightblade. Now the problem with the Magicka Warden is, in order to pull that level of DPS, you will have to use the Bear Ultimate. You will basically have to use a pet, and not all fights are going to be friendly to pets, so that's kind of the downside there. As soon as you drop that pet for a non-pet build, then you end up losing a large amount of your DPS, anywhere between like 15 to 20% of your DPS is actually lost when you no longer use the Bear Ultimate. So that's kind of the downside of the Magicka Warden. You are very reliant on that Bear in order to get the DPS that you're going to be able to see today at the end of the video. Magicka Wardens are also fairly unique in the fact that they are one of the only ranged DPS classes that are capable of providing Major Slayer if they use Master Architect. The only other class that could feasibly do this would be the Magicka Templar. However, if you use the Magicka Templar Ultimate, then you actually aren't using any damage at all if you're using it at range. So Magicka Wardens kind of have this niche role of providing that Major Slayer with very good uptime by using the Bear Ultimate. So Magicka Wardens, definitely don't underestimate them for PvE content, but at the same time they do bring some inherent weaknesses just due to the reliance on that Bear Ultimate. Now, just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gears, our attributes, our skill bars, our CP point distributions, basically everything that you would need to know about this build itself. We'll talk about sort of alternative gear combinations, things like that. We'll go over our rotation, what you should kind of prioritize in your rotation. Magicka Warden rotation is actually fairly simple. It's only 3 dots and 1 spammable, so it's actually, we probably won't spend that much time on the rotation. And then finally we'll close things off with a 6-man dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the amount of DPS you'll be able to pull with this specific build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here, and we'll start things off with our monster helm here. So we have Valken Skoria, so again, like I said, we have 3 dots and 1 spammable, so Skoria is going to be very good here. It's probably the only set that I would recommend wearing as a ranged Magicka Warden DPS. If you are in melee range, if you can play in melee range, you can swap this out with Zaan instead, but otherwise just go with Skoria. You don't have any sort of light shock damage, so you won't necessarily be able to proc Lambrus very well, and that's really the only other Magicka monster helm that's useful for ranged DPS. Narayaneth is a potential option, but with only 1 spammable, it's not really going to be worth it. It will usually not beat out Skoria when it comes to pure DPS. Now Skoria does give us a max health as the one piece, so we can go with all Magicka enchants on our armor. For our 5-piece, this is going to be active on our body at all times. That's going to be Siroria. We have the perfect version here. You can go with the imperfect version instead. The difference between the perfect and the imperfect version is that the perfect version does provide additional max Magicka through that 5-piece bonus. You lose that max Magicka bonus on the 5-piece if you do not have 5 perfect pieces of Siroria. It's a pretty small bonus overall, but it will end up usually being somewhat noticeable in longer fights. For our second 5-piece, we're going with Mother's Sorrow. I have 1 Bloodthirsty, 2 Arcane jewelry traits, and this is going to be the set that's only active on our front bar. So we do have the Inferno Staff of Mother's Sorrow here, infused with a flame damage enchant. And then for our jewelry, we have all spell damage enchants, and again 1 Bloodthirsty, 2 Arcane. You can go with 3 Bloodthirsty instead if you would like. It really depends on how many Bloodthirsty's jewelry traits you have in your DPS, because the more Bloodthirsty traits you have, the shorter the fight's going to take. So in fights where you want to get through Execute a lot faster, it's going to be very useful, but overall it's going to end up being a little bit lower DPS just because the fight doesn't last quite as long. You also have a trade-off when you're using 3 Bloodthirsty in that you lose DPS over the first 75% of the boss's health. So if you're running 2 Arcane and 1 Bloodthirsty, or 2 Bloodthirsty, 1 Arcane for example, you're not giving up as much during that first 75% of the boss fight, because you will have that Arcane boosting your light attacks and your abilities as well. So I like to go with 2 Arcane, 1 Bloodthirsty, but you can go with 3 Bloodthirsty if you would like. Then for our back bar, we have the Maelstrom Inferno staff infused with a weapon damage enchant. Now, really quick, I do want to talk about a couple of gear alternatives here. Instead of Siroria here, you can go with Master Architect instead. If you do decide to go with Master Architect, then this is also going to be a 5-piece that you want active at all times. So this will be on your body or jewelry pieces at all times. If you don't want to use Mother Sorrow, if you can't find Mother Sorrow, then you can go with, let me see here. Go with the Mechanical Acuity instead. This will be a front bar set, so you will have this active on your front bar only. And then you can also go with Burning Spellweave. I personally have somewhat varied success with Burning Spellweave. Sometimes it pulls very well, sometimes it doesn't. That's mainly because as a warden you only really have one source of fire damage, consistent fire damage, and that's going to be from your Blockade. So Burning Spellweave is an option here. Again, it would be a front bar set, much like Acuity and the Mother Sorrow set, but it's overall going to be fairly limited. Now, another set that you could use if you don't have Master Architect or Siroria is actually going to be Necropotent. The bear does count as a pet, so it will increase your max Magicka, and the Betty Netch, the blue Betty, will also count as a pet. So as long as you have one of them up at all times, you will have that 5-piece bonus from Necropotent, and it does help out your light attacks because it did change how light attacks scale in Summerset. So it does scale off of max Magicka on a ratio of 10.5 to 1, just like it does with abilities. So Necropotence is fairly strong on the Magicka Warden. Now let's talk about our character sheet. So I am a Dark Elf here. You can go with High Elves instead if you would like. Dark Elves get 9% max Magicka, 6% max Stamina. They get 7% additional Flame damage and 2% additional Shock and Frost damage. High Elves get 10% max Magicka, 9% Magicka regen, and 4% to Flame, Frost, and Shock damage. So High Elves will have a little bit better sustain because they do have the additional Magicka regen, and they'll have a little bit get a little bit more out of Winter's Revenge. Which is one of the dots that we're going to be using today. But Wardens have a fair amount of magic damage as well. So typically speaking, the Dark Elves will pull ahead just because Blockade, the 7% additional flame damage on Blockade as well as boosting Skoria will usually push them just a little bit ahead of High Elves, but the difference itself is actually pretty small. You can chalk it up to user error most of the time. Another race that I do want to mention here is going to be the Bretons. Bretons get 10% max Magicka, 3960 spell resistance, so that helps out their survivability, and then they also get 3% cost reduction to all Magicka abilities, so that helps out sustain. Not quite as much as the 9% additional Magicka regen that High Elves get, but it is still better than what Dark Elves have. So for our attributes, we have 64 points into Magicka, and we have no points into health. We are using Witch Mothers, but because we have that health bonus from Skoria, we do have a fairly acceptable level of health here. If you want, you can put a couple of points into health if you feel like you are dying too much. You can put 4 or 5 points into health here, and you can end up going over the 17k health recommendation for people who are just starting vet trials. If you're more experienced, then you can go ahead and just put all your points into Magicka and just make sure to use your shields and be aware of fight mechanics and things like that. Now for our Mundus Stone, we're going with the Apprentice here. Again, this build is optimized around having Alkosh active in group, so we have an additional 3000 penetration. If you don't have Alkosh in group, then you might want to run the Lover instead. You will typically end up over-penetrating with the Lover if you are running it and you don't have Alkosh by anywhere between like 300 and 400 penetration. It's a little bit of a trade-off there, but that's generally what I found to be the most effective. You can continue to use the Apprentice, but you will typically be under the spell cap, the penetration cap, unless you put a bunch of points into spell erosion, in which case you are giving up on your other passives as well. So that's something that you're going to want to balance out there. So my general rule of thumb is if you have Alkosh, go Apprentice. If you don't, go with Lover. And then for food, we are using Witch Mother's Potent Brew for the additional Magicka regen. We do end up getting less max Magicka and max health when compared to using blue food, but that additional Magicka regen that we get is actually going to be very strong and very useful overall to our DPS. We are also going to be using Balance for sustain, so we could feasibly use blue food if we want to use Balance more often, but I'd prefer just to go with Witch Mothers just for the additional Magicka regen, so that way we're not taxing our healers too much and we're not taking unnecessary risks by using Balance too much, because that does drop our health by a fair amount. Now for our skills, starting off with our front bar here, we have Crushing Shock here. We actually aren't going to be using Crushing Shock for damage. This is here for two reasons. One, we have that range interrupt using Crushing Shock, and two, we do need a Destruction Staff ability slotted in order to take advantage of the Ancient Knowledge passive, so that's why we have Crushing Shock here. Elemental Weapon, this is going to be our main spamble. You can use Screaming Cliff Racer instead. It's really up to you which one you want to use. Screaming Cliff Racer is just a hair more expensive. It's 44 Magicka more expensive, but it does deal more damage. It does not apply the random status effect, so that's kind of a bummer. But Screaming Cliff Racer does deal more damage the farther away you are. So generally speaking, Cliff Racer will be higher burst damage, but Ellie Weapon is going to be a little bit better overall when it comes to sustain. It will show you guys actually using Cliff Racer instead of Ellie Weapon. Fetcher Infection, then we have Inner Light, and then this is where we put our shield, Harness Magicka, or Dampen Magic. I like Dampen Magic for the additional shield, but you can go with Harness Magicka instead if you want that additional sustain. It's kind of up to you. And then we have the Bear Ultimate here. So we have Ellie Drain here just for the purposes of our parse that we're going to be doing later on. Now for our back bar, we have Winter's Revenge, Blockade of Fire, Blue Betty, Balance, and then I have Channel Acceleration here for the minor force increase. You don't have to run Acceleration if you don't want to. You can run Rearming Trap instead if you know you'll be able to get into melee range every once in a while in order to drop it on cooldown. But again, you don't have to run Channel Acceleration. It does have a cast time associated with it. It does use up Magicka. It's a nice buff overall, and if you can sustain it, since we're using Balance, we can sustain using Acceleration, so we are going to be using Acceleration here. If you don't want to use it though, then you can just slot something like Inner Light instead over here. Then we have to double bar our Bear Ultimate here, so we have Guardian's Wrath a second time. Now for our CP points, we have, I have points in the wrong note here. So we have 250 points to put across each of the different constellations here. So starting off with our green CPs, 75 into Arcanist, 75 into Tenacity. This leaves 100 points, which you can put into the remaining nodes wherever you'd like, depending on the specific passives that you want. I personally have 40 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 28 Warlord, but again, you can kind of split it up however you'd like. So for example, I'm missing the Inspiration Boost passive, I'm missing the Treasure Hunter passive, so you could, take some points and put them out of Warlord, put them into here if you want the Treasure Hunter passive. For our blue CPs, again, I am optimized around having Alkosh active in group. So if you don't have Alkosh active in group and you are using the Apprentice, you will have to put a lot of points into Spell Erosion to make up the loss in penetration. So if you do have to put points into Spell Erosion here, you could drop Ellie Expert down to 56. Then you could take some points out of Staff Expert and Master at Arms. You can probably don't want to touch Thaumaturge because it's already low enough as is. Then you just want to take points out until you hit the appropriate level of penetration that you need in order to hit the penetration cap. But again, if you don't have Alkosh, I highly recommend running the Lover instead, even if it does usually end up, resulting in over penetration for the fight. So for this particular build, we have 56 into Elfborn, 64 into Ellie Expert, 12 into Spell Erosion, 21 into Staff Expert, 66 into Master at Arms, and 31 into Thaumaturge. Now finally, for our red CPs, I take a one-size-fits-most approach, and I will change my CPs depending on the specific trial that we are running, so in order to best minimize the damage that I'm going to be taking as a DPS. So for the balanced approach, I have 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick-Skinned, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now, two nodes that I do want to bring your attention to are going to be Crook Recovery and Bastion. If you put 11 points into one of these two, which basically lets you hit the jump point, you will get the Field Physician passive. And this basically reduces the damage you take by 15% while you're resurrecting somebody. So for progression style guilds, this is very useful to have, mainly because as a magic DPS, you'll typically be the one asked to res first because you do have access to a shield. So this will just help keep you alive while you're resurrecting somebody, since you won't necessarily be able to cast your shield in the middle of a resurrection. Alright, so that's pretty much all of the build information that you guys are going to need. So now let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. So I'm just going to unsummon my bear so he doesn't end up attacking this dummy when we do our 6-man dummy parse. Obviously, you want to start off with drinking a potion first, and then you always want to start off with pre-buffed. So you always want to have acceleration up and your blue Betty up before you enter a fight. Then you start with Blockade, Winter's Revenge, Fetter Infection, and then you do your Spamble, whether that's Ellie Weapon or Cliff Racer. Then you just want to reapply your dots when they expire. Now, when you want to use Balance, that's kind of up to you. I like to use it usually every time I'm on my back bar. It's not always every time, as you will see when we do the actual parse, but as often as I can. Now remember, challenge acceleration does have a cast time associated with it, so you do want to recast it preferably before the duration actually expires and kind of time it out. So if you have 2 seconds left on it, that's when you just kind of want to go back and reapply it. So you can see here there's not really a set rotation for Magicka Wardens, and that's because our dots don't really line up very well in terms of duration. So our 3 dots are Blockade, Winter's Revenge, and Fetter Infection. Blockade has an 8-second duration, Winter's Revenge has a 12-second duration, and Fetter Infection has a 10-second duration. So they don't really line up very well at all. So you're going to have a very dynamic rotation. So basically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pick up a buff tracker, so for example Strendar or Action Duration Reminder, and you just want to reapply the dots when they expire. All 3 of your dots are fairly strong, so you don't want any of them to drop off too much. So you do want to make sure, especially if you have to prioritize any of them, prioritize Blockade for the Maelstrom Staff enchant. But you do want to maintain all 3 dots as best you can. You can use your bear ultimate whenever you want, whenever it's active. Doesn't really matter if you activate it on your front bar or your back bar. Try to activate it on your back bar though, because you do have the additional set pieces active on your front bar here, so you do want to activate it on your front bar. Try to avoid activating on your back bar if you can help it. But it doesn't really matter overall in the end which bar you activate your bear ultimate on. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with a 6 million dummy parse. So this is going to give you an idea of the level of DPS you can pull. Remember that this is a pet build, so you won't necessarily be able to use this build in fights that are unfriendly to pets. So for example, the mage in Ethereal Archive, Zazhasha, the bear can die to the Zazhasha's pillar mechanic, and the Assembly General and Halls of Fabrication, unless you're able to really precisely control your pet. You might not want to bring a pet to Assembly General because of the invulnerability phase where the pet can reflect the damage that it deals to the Assembly General back onto you or your group members. So that's just something you want to keep in mind here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this parse here. Again, I will pre-buff and I will try and narrate through it. So again, we do want to try to get our bear ultimate off while we're on our front bar for the additional spell crit there. I can actually probably be a little bit further back. Generally speaking, if you're going to be using Cliff Racer as your ultimate, you want to be pretty much as far back as you possibly can to maximize the amount of bonus damage you get from that secondary effect. So you basically want to be about as far back as Blockade will reach. Because again, I can probably back up a little bit more to about here. You can see here we don't really have a set rotation, we don't have a fixed rotation. It's pretty much all whichever dot happens to fall off, we go back and reapply it. I actually think I might be a little bit too far back. I'm not sure if my Blockade is hitting. Alright, so there we go. That is the Magicka Warden parse here. So that's what we managed to pull, 37.9k, pretty decent overall. This is with Screaming Cliff Racer as well. So I do have a parse saved up with a using Ele Weapon instead. So this is with Elemental Weapon here. And we can see we pulled 40.4k. This is the exact same setup, so Siroria with Mother Sorrow here. So with Ele Weapon, we do get additional burning DPS, we do get some shield and concuss procs, so you do usually end up helping out your minor vulnerability uptime a little bit. So you can see here we got 26% on this parse, but we got no minor vulnerability here, so that'll help boost the DPS by a little bit. It's only going to be about 2% additional, so you are still going to end up pulling lower overall if you're going to be using Screaming Cliff Racer instead of Ele Weapon. But Cliff Racer is a viable alternative for Ele Weapon instead if you don't want to use that. And like I said, you can see here our 3 dots here are all pretty much pretty strong. You don't necessarily want to lose them too much. And you can see just how much DPS that the bear is able to pull. So 7.6 plus 3.8 plus 2.9, you know, it's adding up to be about, you know, 13-14% of our DPS. So losing that bear for a non-pet build usually does end up dropping our DPS by a fair amount. So that's something to keep in mind. So the bear does a huge amount of damage. You can see here it managed to crit for 81k. This is when we use the ultimate. So when you have all of your buffs up, so minor force with major force with warhorn, if you have minor berserk from combat prayer, the crit that it can do, it can be pretty substantial. I've seen crits up to 120, 130k on some of my parses with raid buffs. So the bear is a very, very powerful ultimate to use, and it is the key behind Magicka Wardens being able to pull very good DPS. So if you compare this parse to some of other parses here, you can see 40.4k, that's pretty much on par with pet sorks. Definitely beats out non-pet sorks, but doesn't quite reach Magicka Nightblade in terms of range DPS. So that is it for this video. If you guys have any questions or comments about this build, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to get back to them as quickly as I can. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.